Well, welcome to the 700 Club. Unprecedented chaos. A whistleblower, his identity unknown, his testimony based on hearsay. And he instigates an impeachment inquiry. Who changed the rules? Amber Strong has the latest on the report that's rocking Washington. Great.
The whistleblower at the center of a complaint that helped launch an impeachment inquiry into President Trump is expected to testify privately before Congress if lawmakers can ensure that his identity is safe. President Trump wants to hear from the whistleblower too, tweeting, "I want to meet not only my accuser, but also the person who illegally gave this information."
It's all hearsay. You can't get a parking ticket conviction based on hearsay.
Trump attorney Jay Sekulow claims the whistleblower rules recently changed.
The form that so-called whistleblowers fill out used to say this: in order to find an urgent concern credible, the Inspector General must be in possession of reliable, first-hand information. That was on the form, literally, until apparently very recently.
The complaint says Mr. Trump pressured Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky to investigate political rival Joe Biden and his son Hunter's dealings in Ukraine. The president's defenders call the whistleblower biased.
The Inspector General says there's an indicia of arguable political bias. That is Washington speak for. This guy didn't like the president.
That same Inspector General, however, called the complaint credible. President Trump's former security advisor saying he's troubled by the call.
It is a bad day and a bad week for this president and for this country if he is asking for political dirt on an opponent.
Democratic members of the House have launched a slew of subpoenas against the State Department and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo.
I have to imagine they're going to fight us tooth and nail. And yet, even as they do, the more that they fight to try to prevent and obstruct the lawful functions of Congress, the more they're going to make a case for impeachment on obstruction of justice.
Meanwhile, the Biden campaign sent a letter to major news networks calling on them to stop having Trump lawyer Rudy Giuliani on their shows, claiming he's spreading debunked conspiracy theories. Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi has a message of her own for the White House.
Speak the truth and let us work together to have this be a unifying experience, not a dividing one for our country.
But recent polling suggests the country is divided. While there's increasing support for impeachment, it mostly falls along party lines. Amber Strong, CBN News in Washington.
Ladies and gentlemen, Jesus Christ said it right when he said a house divided against itself can't stand. A kingdom divided against itself cannot endure. And if we continue this partisanship, this nation will be torn apart. And one Pastor Jeffrey said something about it's a civil war. Well, it's not a fighting war, but it's a war of concepts and ideas. And our country is being torn apart. And if the Democrats don't stop what they're doing, it doesn't seem that there's any end to this impeachment thing, because when it goes to the Senate, it's going to fail. There is no possibility of getting an impeachment trial through the Republican-controlled Senate. It's just not going to happen. So all this is an exercise in futility to make the president look bad so that he will be weakened and he deals with other nations. Do we want this? Do we want to weaken the leader of our country? Well, of course not. Well, in other news, on the cyber front, our own military, outclassed by the Russians and the Chinese. Now the Navy is fighting back. John Jessup has more on that story from our CBN News Bureau.
That's right, Pat, and that's why the Navy is taking steps to improve cybersecurity and its ability to conduct cyber warfare. NBC News reports 2 reviews in the past year have found the Navy isn't keeping up with foes like Russia and China, and noted significant breaches in cybersecurity systems. Specifically, China has stolen military information from the Navy, as well as trade secrets from private contractors. The Navy now creating a new head of cyber to oversee information management, cybersecurity, and digital strategies.
Well, I'm pleased to report that Regent University has now, in its cyber range, is having a training facility for members of the United States Navy. They're wonderful people, and the Navy has been very, very pleased with the training they're receiving. This is, you know, we have a huge Navy facility here in Tidewater, and some of those people are having training at CBN at Regent University. John?
Well, in keeping with that theme, cyber attacks, EMPs, and even natural disasters can knock out the power grid, leaving millions of people in the dark. National security correspondent Eric Phillips describes the threat and what can be done to stop it.
I want you to stop and think about how much we use electricity in our everyday lives, from water to ATMs, gas pumps, medical equipment, and the list really goes on and on. But now think about our nation's power grid that supplies that electricity and it being damaged or disabled for weeks, months, even up to a year. It's a very real possibility, and experts say it can happen in several different ways. But they also say there's something we can do about it.
We risk everything.
Frank Gaffney heads the Center for Security Policy in Washington, D.C. He's on the front lines of sounding the alarm about the vulnerability of the nation's electric grid.
Our electric infrastructure is very susceptible.
One of those dangers is what's known as an EMP, or electromagnetic pulse, which can happen if an adversary detonates a nuclear weapon in space, causing a burst of radiation that won't hurt people but would fry our electric grid. The same thing could happen naturally in the event of a solar storm. Then there's another naturally occurring process deep within the Earth that could result in what's known as a magnetic pole reversal. Dr. Hugh Ross talked about it on a recent edition of the 700 Club.
The biggest consequence is the damage it could do to our electric power grids.
What can we do? Gaffney says there are several effective steps the military took to protect sensitive assets some 30 years ago after discovering these vulnerabilities.
What are called surge protectors. Sort of think of what you hopefully have your computer plugged into, only bigger. Shunts, which essentially move electric current around what you're trying to protect. And Faraday cages. And it turns out that, while we may not know it, almost all of us now have a Faraday cage in our homes. It's called a microwave oven.
These protective measures would cost billions of dollars, and at least one organization questions the need. The Electric Power Research Institute, or EPRI, is an independent nonprofit. In a recent report, it said while protecting the grid would be helpful, even without it, quote, possible damage to large power transformers was found to be minimal. Gaffney is critical of the report, saying EPRI is closely aligned with the electric utilities. He says their findings clash sharply with those of a federal commission that studied the problem.
And its chairman estimated that if the lights were to go out and stay out for a year or more, 9 out of 10 of us would die.
Gaffney warns those stakes are too high to take chances.
Even if no enemy used either what's called EMP or sabotage or cyber attacks to take down our grid with catastrophic consequences for our country and our people, Mother Nature is going to do it.
There's an ongoing debate about who would pay for an upgrade to the electric grid, whether it would be the government or electric utilities or some combination of big business and public dollars. I should also mention that I did reach out to EPRI for an interview, and they declined my request. In Washington, Eric Phillips, CBN News.
Pat, some nightmare situations described in Eric's package.
I've been warning about this for years. Our electric grid is incredibly vulnerable. And here's the deal. If the North Koreans would send a missile over the pole and with a low-yield nuclear bomb detonate that thing around the neighborhood of Chicago and do it at about 1,500 feet or 2,000 feet in the air, it would fry the grid, the entire nation. And as Frank Gaffney said, millions would die. We're talking about catastrophe. Now, what's it going to take to fix the grid? Well, it'll take maybe $4 or $5 billion. It's peanuts considering to the trillion we're spending on our budget. It's nothing. And the federal government ought to do it. It is a national emergency that should be dealt with immediately. And as Frank Gaffney so intelligently brought about, a number of steps could be taken immediately. But we're talking about a few $1 billion to save the lives of 80 or 90% of us. We're talking about something that is critical and should be dealt with as we speak. because it would take one. For example, Tom Clancy had a thing about a freighter that comes into Baltimore Harbor and then sets off a nuclear bomb. Well, you can do that now. I mean, they could have a freighter with a launch mechanism to set up a nuclear device in the atmosphere. It wouldn't take much. It wouldn't take much. And of course, if there's a solar flare, it could do it naturally. But there's so many things. Ladies and gentlemen, it is absolutely critical. And if there's one thing you ought to call your congressman, call the White House, call whoever you call, and say, look, let's fix the grid. It's not, I mean, yes, if the government has to step in and pay for it, well, good for them. You know, I'm not for government interference with much of anything, but in this case, this is a national emergency that should be taken care of immediately. Well, now, have you heard the prophecy that's running around on Facebook and various places that some rabbi has said, well, when we get two prime ministers named Benjamin, the Messiah will come. We've got Benjamin Netanyahu, and we've got Benjamin Gantz of the Blue and White Party. And I think, without question, I know both of those guys, and they're both strong, patriotic men. Neither one of them are way off on either side. And there's no reason in the world they don't come together and form a unified government. I think they're going to do it. But would that be some prophetic thing, though, that you've got Benjamin Netanyahu and Benjamin Gantz forming and having two prime ministers both named Benjamin? Isn't that crazy?
Unlikely.
Yeah, well, we'll see what happens. Well, anyhow, here's the story.
That's right, Pat. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his opposition leader Benny Gantz will again try to form a unity government. They're set to meet once more Wednesday evening after the Israeli holidays. On Sunday, representatives from Netanyahu's Likud party and Gantz's Blue and White party restarted negotiations after Netanyahu failed to form a ruling coalition. Israeli President Reuven Rivlin has said he wants to avoid a third round of elections and that he wants a national unity government. Well, once again, confrontations between police and protesters turned violent on the streets of Hong Kong this weekend. Pro-democracy protesters threw Molotov cocktails and hurled bricks. Police responded by firing rounds of tear gas and storming into the crowd, leading to many arrests. The protesters believe China is encroaching on their freedoms. All this as Beijing prepares to celebrate Tuesday the 70th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. Some fear the Chinese will soon send forces into Hong Kong to end the ongoing protests and restore order. Well, back here at home, while temperatures are still around 90 in some parts of the country, it already looks like winter in places like Montana and neighboring states after a major storm dumped record amounts of snow this weekend. The National Weather Service called it historic. The brunt of the storm hitting Montana, with Weather.com reporting 4 feet of snow falling in one small town and heavy snow elsewhere in the state. Montana Governor Steve Bullock declared an emergency. Major interstates and highways did remain open, but snow and ice covered many stretches of the western part of the state. Well, last night marked the start of the Jewish New Year, and here at CBN, we celebrated the Feast of Trumpets with our annual Rosh Hashanah celebration. CBN staff met on campus at the Shaw Chapel for an evening of praise and worship featuring Paul Wilbur, Don Heist, and our very own Pat Robertson.
The shofar sounded at dusk last night in the CBN Regent University Shaw Chapel, celebrating Rosh Hashanah and signaling the beginning of the Jewish New Year.
Rosh Hashanah signifies the second coming of Jesus Christ.
Rosh Hashanah reminds God's people to reflect on the past year and trust God's promises for the year ahead. It's a time of renewal, planning, and expectation.
We're getting ready to meet the King. We're getting ready to meet the King. Praise God.
Worship leader Paul Wilbur led much of the Rosh Hashanah celebration.
Your love is far better than life itself. Yeah. He's preparing you to be a part of that bride without spot or wrinkle.
It was a night filled with singing, dancing, and prayer.
Father, I thank you for this time. I thank you for Tabernacles. I thank you for Jesus. I thank you for the lid of covering. I thank you, Lord, for the mercy seat. Thank you for the sacrifice on the cross. I thank you for all the good things that you've done.
Those who came experienced a wonderful night of worship and gave thanks to God for a joyful new year.
Pat, it looks like you all had an amazing time together last night.
It was remarkable.
It was beautiful, as always. I mean, Paul really led beautifully, and you shared so much about why we gather and do this. It was a wonderful celebration.
Rosh Hashanah. Rosh is the head, and Hashanah is of the year. This is the Jewish New Year. It's the beginning of the year, and we look at the Feast of Tabernacles as the one feast of the Old Testament that has not had a New Testament fulfillment. We had a New Testament fulfillment in the feast which led to the Exodus, the covering of the Jews by the blood of Christ as the death angel marched over, and Jesus Christ was our Passover sacrifice. We have the feast, the deal with the first fruits, which is Pentecost, 50 days later. So those two have had New Testament fulfillment. The one that hasn't is the final harvest, which is what is signified by the Feast of Tabernacles. And so we celebrate that because we look for the second coming of Jesus.